I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico, and I have a cold.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Delaf, and I don't have a cold, but I am very tired.
Great. Well, I think we're on an even playing field then.
I think so. Between the two of us, we make up exactly one healthy, functioning person.
I hope so. At least 75% of a functioning person. Well, this week on the Magnificast, we're going to do our best to be two functioning people. And we're here celebrating the feast day of Saint Oscar Romero. You might know him. You might have heard of him. Romero's feast day is officially celebrated on March 24th, and we've talked about him a handful of times on this podcast, but we're going to do it again. Specifically in the past, you can go check out our episode with Matt Eisenbrandt called The Assassination of a Saint, where we talk about Romero's death and the legal issues around it. It's a very good episode, and The Assassination of a Saint, Matt Eisenbrandt's book, is good. You should go read it. It's a classic, and it's going to make you mad for sure. If you like listening to true crime podcasts, this book is for you. It's a true crime book about the assassination of Oscar Romero.
Man, actually, wait a second. Side note about that, though, before we get to Romero.
Yeah, please.
There is, it's a great book, for sure. It's also great if you're like a law nerd and you want to learn about why murderers don't get prosecuted in the global south and how hard it is to take them to justice in the global north. It's a great book. Also, side note, though, I couldn't help but think of Romero when I recently watched a great HBO documentary from 2020 recently called The Art of Political Murder, which is about the assassination of Bishop Girardi in Guatemala. And I want to bring it up now because I probably will forget to do it later. But I think Girardi is also a very interesting character. And on the feast day of Saint Oscar Romero, I just think it's like a great documentary if you're looking for other media sort of around issues of, bishops in Latin America who are killed because of their moral stand. Anyway, a bit of a sidebar, but like I said, if I didn't bring it up now, it wouldn't make it to my brain later on.
No, it's good. It's good to bring it up now. If you're a person who is interested in the CIA-backed assassination of many Catholic priests, boy, do I have some interesting things to tell you. Some troubling news for you about a whole genre of media that you're going to be interested in. So in this episode, though, we are going to talk about, we'll talk about Romero. We'll talk about his death here in a minute, his assassination, because it's an important part of the story. But we're going to, maybe more importantly, talk about Romero's thoughts on the relationship between Christianity and politics in an address that he gave at the University of Leuven, which is in Belgium, of all places. The address was called The Political Dimension of Faith from the Perspective of the Option for the Poor. But before we get to the words of Romero himself, here's a bit of biographical information about him. Dean, do you want to do the biographical information? Or we can switch off if you want.
Yeah, that sounds great. Oscar Romero, he was a bishop and later the Archbishop of San Salvador in El Salvador. And today, a lot of people associate him closely with liberation theology, which I think is probably not exactly right. He went out of his way to distance himself a little bit, but also not exactly wrong either. Liberation theologians are very into Romero. There's obviously a shared spirit there. Anyway, neither here nor there. At the same time, when he was made the Archbishop of San Salvador, he was actually a more moderate or even conservative choice. So the Vatican has a habit of appointing bishops in significant sees or dioceses in politically tense situations that sort of won't upset the political reality. And unfortunately, too, in the latter half of the 20th century, there were lots of examples of the Vatican appointing bishops in countries with dictatorships, like in El Salvador at this time, who would, not be a radical leftist or something, but just kind of like keep the wheels on the tracks of the church going through a hard time. And the assumption was that Romero would be like that he would be a chill, conservative bishop. He was already a conservative guy. But he had a pretty profound experience, a few anyway, that slowly turned him in a different direction. The assassination of a guy named Retiro Grande, who's also a saint now, a priest, and he was a close friend of Romero's in 1977, had a really profound impact on Romero. And after that killing, Romero took up a similar theological and political position toward the poor and toward liberation, which Grande was kind of like urging Romero to do, but Romero had some cold feet. That story is sometimes contested too in the literature. Like some people are like, Romero actually was sort of already making his own kind of journey in this direction, and the assassination of Grande was just like, I don't know, it wasn't like the catalytic moment. It was just like an important moment. But anyway, that's for scholars, I guess, to figure out. In any case, it is important because nevertheless, whatever the truth of that is, Romero and Grande both are celebrated in El Salvador, along with many other martyrs, including people we've talked about in the show elsewhere, like Ignacio Ecuria, for example, and many others. Anyway, the point here is Romero was expected to be, a basic sort of run-of-the-mill conservative bishop in one of the most important dioceses in El Salvador in the middle of a pretty brutal situation, and instead he turned to a champion of the poor, delivering homilies on the radio, really becoming a guy who wasn't afraid to call out human rights abuses and violence from his position as a moral authority.
That's right. He was supposed to be a basic archbishop, but really, he was a based archbishop. All right. So that's like maybe the first part of the story. The second important part of the story that you gotta know is that in El Salvador at the time, political tensions had been on the rise for a while, to say the least. But a military coup that was staged in October 1979 kicked off what's basically a full-on civil war that would last until 1992. During the time, there was a wave of political violence caused by numerous right-wing paramilitary organizations. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the United States, led by then Jimmy Carter, supported the right-wing government, lest El Salvador become like Nicaragua or Cuba. Romero even wrote a letter to Jimmy Carter saying that the U.S.'s endorsement and military aid to the government would definitely sharpen the political persecution and violence in the country. And Romero was right, and Jimmy Carter would go on to regret it later, as Dean told me before this conversation. I was mad about Jimmy Carter, and Dean told me that he regretted it. And I'm still mad about Jimmy Carter. That's okay, though. Anyways, the Catholic Church in El Salvador more or less took the side of the poor, which is kind of an interesting turn, who were facing some pretty intense repression from the government, and the clergy and lay people in base communities basically all suffered because of it. Here's a quote from the address that we're going to read here in a minute, that Romero wrote, that just kind of lays out the persecution that the church in El Salvador faced, and I think it's pretty serious. So Romero says, in less than 3 years, more than 50 priests have been attacked, threatened, calumniated. 6 are already martyrs. They were murdered. Some have been tortured, and others have been expelled from the country. Nuns have also been persecuted. The archdiocesan radio station and educational institutions that are Catholic or of a Christian inspiration have also been attacked, threatened, intimidated, and even bombed. So I think it's interesting to note that because, let's see, I guess when I say that there's like political persecution of the Catholic Church in El Salvador, I want to make a pretty hard distinction that it's not like the political persecution that people on the right say they face today. Mm-hmm. It's like real, actual political persecution. And I think it's important to kind of lay it out because, it's just, you got to be real about it, I think. In a time where people feign all kinds of persecution, it's like good to be reminded that there are people who've actually faced real threats and not made up ones from the woke mob. Romero himself, though, he would be amongst those victims of political persecution, who was executed, assassinated by a right-wing death squad who is directed by the U.S. trained Robert D'Aubusson. You'll hear a lot about if you go listen to the episode about the assassination of a saint. Anyways, he was assassinated while he gave mass, like in the middle of church on March 24th, 1980. A pretty horrific scene. So people got out of a car, they shot him, and they drove right away. So that's Oscar Romero in a nutshell. A very tiny nutshell. But we'll kind of get into more of the character of him as a political and theological thinker here in just a minute.
Yeah, I think it's also helpful to plot where this address fits in some of the events we were just talking about. Romero had this conversion to social justice or to being a voice for the poor, but he was not a bishop very long. And it's pretty remarkable the level of intensity and the speed at which all these things we were just mentioning kind of happen in succession. So, for example, the address that we're going to read is from February 2nd, 1980. The letter that he wrote to Jimmy Carter, which is hosted on the website of the USCCB, the Catholic Bishops' Conference website, that was written on February 17th, 1980, and then Romero was killed March 24th. So, like, in the span of basically, less than 2 months, all these things are kind of going on. And we should say, too, so Romero, he was shot as he said mass. Two extra things to maybe note about it. His bloodied vestments are like still on display. Like people make pilgrimage to them in El Salvador. And Romero famously said, "If I die, I'll be resurrected in the people of El Salvador," which is very true, I think. So that's one important piece. He was canonized by Pope Francis not too long ago. And the other piece is, Matt mentioned that Roberto D'Aubusson was supported by the United States. He was a School of Americas grad, I think. His son is still right now a political figure in El Salvador. And a lot of the U.S. politicians who supported D'Aubusson, like explicitly they supported him, have gone on to enjoy pretty easy careers. For example, I think we talked about this on the Eisenbright episode too, but what is the guy's name who was the Venezuela special rapporteur under Trump? Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams famously testified to Congress that Roberto D'Aubusson is great, not a bad guy, a good one, and that is a wildly stupid and evil thing for a person to say. But nevertheless, he did say it. And yeah, like I said, he was put in charge of Venezuela under Donald Trump. So, these kind of like villains are still around. And I think it's important to recognize that, like, I feel like sometimes people cast Romero's story back into the past. Like 1980 was a long time ago. It's like a lost world in some ways. But the fact is, like, these major players who are part of Romero's story are still around. And like the bad guys are still around. But the good guys are still around too, right? Like, as we learned when we had Laurel on the podcast a while back, like the base communities are maybe different now, but they're not gone. And just important to maybe recognize how close we are to these events as we sort of get into this particular address.
So I think that gives you a little bit of an idea of like Romero, what he's like, what he's kind of about, and also it gives you a little bit more context about El Salvador as a place in the 80s, in the late 70s. All really helpful context for making the following address make a lot more sense. So let's talk about the address a little bit here, and we can kind of lay out some of the big themes and talk about maybe the high points of it for us. The address here is called The Political Dimension of Faith from the Perspective of the Option for the Poor. And it's a really cool piece. I think it's pretty short. We'll definitely post it in the show notes. You can read it yourself if you want to. But what I like about it is that since he's giving it in this like kind of drastically different context, like he's giving it in Belgium, right, which is certainly not El Salvador, and he makes that clear, I think, in the essay or in the address itself. But because of that, I think a lot of like some of his thoughts become not decontextualized, but like you get these like sort of top level reads on them that I think are helpful without having to like get into the weeds too much about like what is going on in El Salvador. So, I mean, for a reader who is like not super familiar with the history like me, this is a really helpful thing to kind of get into to see like, I mean, maybe the broad contours of the way that Romero thinks about politics and thinks about theology. So that's what you get in this is some of those big themes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there are at least three big themes that we can kind of pull out of this text. So one is that Romero suggests that there's like a hermeneutic of the poor as a way to like read the world for the church. We'll talk about what that means more in a few minutes. But I think it's a pretty big deal. He thinks that like basically if the church wants to really know the world and be kind of like a good actor in it, then it has to take up this position alongside the poor who know the socioeconomic factors of the world better than anybody else because they're constantly being acted on by them. Another big theme in this text is about the relationship between religion and politics, which is something I always think is really fascinating and something that is, I think, more and more a pressing question of our times as the Christo-fascist right continues to gain steam in the United States. Definitely interesting, and the way that Romero goes about it is obviously better than that. So get excited for it. And then I think the last thing that I think is really cool about this particular address is that he's writing from the late 70s and into 1980, and he keeps talking about the church in El Salvador and how it's allying itself with the poor and how it's coming alongside the poor and how it's using the perspective of the poor to kind of like do its work in the world. And it is such an interesting, I think, way to talk about the church because it looks drastically different than the church that I've ever seen in the United States and probably anyone's ever seen in the United States. So anyways, I think it's also like, it's one of those documents where you can see a better type of Christianity on display. It's not perfect for sure, right? I mean, there's always problems, but it's a type of church that is like the type of church you really want to be a part of or that you really wish you could see in the world. And I think that's cool, right? So I think there's something about this essay too that gives you like permission to be a particular type of Christian. When you see all the reactionary forces of Christianity in the world, I think it's easy to like sometimes want to throw your hands up about the whole thing and just say, whatever, take it. But when you read this essay, you hear about a type of church that is like worth being a part of. And that's, I think, exciting. So we have those three big themes, and I'm sure we'll probably pull out a few more. But that's it. So let's just jump into it. Let's get to Romero and the way he thinks of the poor as a type of like hermeneutic tool to understand the world. I feel saying like the poor is a hermeneutic tool makes it sound too academic-y, but I think it's important, right? Because Romero sees in the poor like a really like an essential perspective for the church, that if the church wants to really, do the work that the gospel tells you to do, then you have to take up this particular perspective and not like try to moderate it between, some kind of class harmony. So like Dean said at the beginning, that Romero is not like a liberation theologian in the same way that like Leonardo Boff is a liberation theologian. Definitely not in the way that Leonardo Boff is a liberation theologian. But I think what you'll see is like that shared spirit, especially with Romero's particular approach to the poor.
Well, I think it's also really interesting that Romero feels confident enough to like speak from the perspective of the poor as well. Like, you see some interesting ways that this shows up in the text. Sometimes he talks about what the church says to the poor, and then other times he tries to articulate the vision of the poor. And I think, like with a lot of theologians, I'm always very nervous when people speak in the name of the poor, because it's like, who are you to do that? You're like a theologian. But one thing that Romero does is he styles himself as a pastor, and that's actually how he opens the address, is by saying he's not speaking as an expert or a political scientist. He's speaking as a person with a particular role to play in a Christian community. And I think that like Romero is one of those people who, when he says that he is like, telling you what the poor think, it's like, yeah, I believe him. He's probably right. That probably is what they think. So just a neat way to maybe set up some of the context here too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so here's the first passage that we're going to work through. Our encounter with the poor has regained for us the central truth of the gospel. Namely, the word of God urges us to conversion. The church has to proclaim the good news to the poor, those who, in this worldly terms, have heard bad news and who have lived through even worse realities, and hence they also have good news to proclaim to the rich, that they too must become poor in order to share in the benefits of the kingdom with the poor. I like this first part too, because it I like it for two reasons, right? Because you always hear the good news to the poor, but Romero is recognizing fully here that the poor have heard nothing but bad news their entire life, but also that the poor have something to give in this conversation, right? They can proclaim the good news to the rich, that they have to actually become poor. A pretty good rhetorical turn. to say the least. And I think doing a lot of sort of like theological and social justice-y types of work in this passage. I don't know, Dean, how do you feel?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's great too that it is a theology that sort of takes a side. Like Romero is not being like, well, we got the rich and the poor, and God has maybe a preferential love for the poor, but we can't like get too, I don't know, crabby at the rich. Romero like threads that needle really well, because I think he's like also not maybe speaking in too crabby a way in this passage, but he is like making something very clear, right? That like the rich have to just stop being rich, and that's sort of the key. They can't like maintain that position, which I think is a really important and courageous thing for Romero to say. I think also like, we've talked about this on the show in a number of other contexts, but the category of the poor is really interesting for kind of Christian Marxist dialogue in general. Like for Marx, the key category is the proletariat. For liberation theology, or more broadly, like, the maybe sort of church of the poor you find in Latin America, the category is the poor, which is a more amorphous category, but also a pretty interesting site to like locate the place where you find change. And we can talk more about it in a minute, because Romero goes out of his way to sort of, I don't know, lean more into that category in a political way, and not just like a totally nebulous way, but just kind of flagging it now, like it's a nice example of maybe what the rhetoric of like the poor and the rich in the church sort of affords Romero in a political way. And it's important too that he's doing that, because in El Salvador, the FMLN, the guerrilla movement, the Marxist movement, is pretty significant. And like Romero is trying to navigate, how to find his own voice without like completely becoming the spokesperson of the FMLN, which he definitely didn't want to do. For better or for worse, I guess people can judge that however they want. But he's kind of leaning into this category of the poor in a way that I think actually helpfully articulates like what's unique about a Christian dialogue about social justice.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, a pretty helpful distinction to make. Because when Marxists talk about the workers or the working class or the proletariat or whatever, right? It's because the working class, I mean, it's not because of like a moral importance necessarily, right? Like it's because the workers have like they have the keys to capital if they really want to exercise that power, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when liberation theology talks about the poor, it's talking about like an ethical category. It's not the poor aren't important because they can topple capitalism. The poor are important because Jesus was poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's like the difference. But you're right; it does give a different texture to talk about social justice through.
Mm-hmm. So maybe leaning into that a little bit more too. A couple other pieces that Romero talks about. I said we are going to talk about it in a minute, but we might as well just talk about it now. We're already there.
Let's do it.
Romero says, "It is something new among our people that today the poor see in the church a source of hope and a support for their noble struggle for liberation. The hope that our church encourages is neither naive nor passive. It is rather a summons from the Word of God for the great majority of the people, the poor, that they assume their proper responsibility, that they undertake their own conscientization, that in a country where it is illegal or practically prohibited, at some periods more than others, that they set about organizing themselves. And it is support, sometimes critical support, for their just causes and demands. The hope that we preach to the poor is intended to give them back their dignity, to encourage them to take charge of their own future. In a word, the church has not only turned toward the poor, it has made of the poor the special beneficiaries of its mission." So this is the maybe like, if Marx is like, you got to get the working class organized and that's who's going to overthrow capitalism, this is maybe Romero's alternative vision, his manifesto moment, to say that it's the poor who have to find a way to organize themselves, and the church's role is to sort of create hope in that situation, such that the poor could feel like they have the dignity to become conscious of their situation, to take charge of their own future, as he puts it. And I think that is a really interesting contribution of liberation theology generally, and something that you see come together in certain movements, as opposed to like pulling away from Marxist movements, for example, in Nicaragua, right, where like the theological category of the poor and the sort of Marxist currents in the Sandinista movement didn't really see each other as enemies, but found ways to dialogue. And I think Romero too here, I don't think he's setting up like a competing vision with like Marxism. I mean, he's not a Marxist, so like maybe he is doing that in some way or another. But I think his intention really is to try to like find a way of sort of making the poor a political category and not just like, a sort of vacuous platitude or like a theological nicety or something like that. Like he's trying to be like, what the church does is it finds the poor and then it says like, look, you have like agency and you could do something here. They might not all have their hands on like capital in the same way that the working class does. But also there's like, there's more poor than proletarians in, in El Salvador as well, So important to just think through kind of how Romero is like activating that category.
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, it's right. Romero is not a Marxist. And if this is a competing vision with Marxism, it's not a very good competing vision because it's like pretty much like it makes a pretty good partner to Marxism, right?
Mhm,
I don't know. It's not mutually exclusive, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So far, we've talked about the poor in this like kind of abstract way, which is, fine. I mean, again, this is like an address that Romero is giving to a a university in Europe, so he's not like gonna get into the weeds like sociologically about it, I guess. But I do want to kind of lay it out here that he does pay attention to like, the poor as a category, but not just like a vague sort of like blob. I think he recognized too that like the poor in El Salvador have have a lot of skin in the game. I was just talking a minute ago I guess at the beginning of the episode about the persecution that the Catholic Church faced, and that's all true. Though later in the text, Romero kind of gives this other nod towards the types of persecution that other people are facing as well. And it's worth, I think, pointing out here because it's like the poor are these like is this character in the story, but like Romero, I think, recognizes rightly that the poor are like facing pretty serious persecution in the ways that the church is as well. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say here is that like there's something real. There's more to the story than just like the poor as like an empty category. So Romero says if all of this persecution happened to persons who are the most evident representatives of the church, you can guess what has happened to ordinary Christians, to the campesinos, to the catechists, to lay ministers, and to the ecclesial-based communities. There have been threats, arrests, tortures, and murders numbering in the hundreds and thousands. And as always, even in persecution, it has been the poor among the Christians who have suffered the most. I think that it's important to lay this out because, man, it's real. It's a real thing that happened. I was reading this today, but I was also reading it alongside Penny Leno's book, The Cry of the People, which is a book that I think we've mentioned on this podcast a handful of times. We'll have to get around to doing a real episode about it at some point. But the book opens with this really, I think, kind of hard to read but important to read narrative about an Irish Catholic priest in Argentina who is like walking home one night with one of I don't know, this woman that he goes to church with, and like out of nowhere they're arrested by a paramilitary group in Argentina, and they are like subsequently tortured for like days on end, if not months. The priest, because he's Irish, he gets deported from the country and like has to go back to Ireland and work through like the mental disruption that this has given him in his life. Meanwhile, the woman that he was like walking with, who was just like, a regular church person, they were like imprisoned for years after, right, and faced even more types of torture and like imprisonment and detention and all kinds of crazy stuff, right? And that's Argentina and not El Salvador, and they're different places with different circumstances. But all I'm trying to say here is that like fascists are willing to crack down on anyone who might speak out against them, right? And it's worth really paying attention to those stories because, I mean, whatever. This particular priest, like he was a worker priest from Ireland, which is something, but it's not like he was like out there like organizing a communist revolution or something. He was just a priest like in Argentina, and that did not matter to the paramilitary there, just like it didn't matter to the paramilitary in El Salvador, and just like it doesn't matter to anyone in the United States whether or not you're really whether you're just a nice like human rights liberal or if you're really a communist. It does not matter to them. Fascists don't care. Fascists just want to kill you if you're going to speak out against them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the lesson that you see in some kind of ironic ways, also in so many circumstances. Like, I always think of the Philippines, right now with something like red tagging, which is everywhere, where the government will basically label somebody communist, whether they are or not, and then arrest them or, harass them and so on. But one very funny kind of inverse side of that is that it creates like odd friends in ways that create enemies for the regimes as well, which is something that you saw all across Latin America, but also in the Philippines, and elsewhere too. Like, I guess everywhere there are fascists. The inverse side of fascists sort of being incapable of discriminating against their enemies or whatever is that, like, all of a sudden people who would have been anti-communists yesterday suddenly find themselves talking to communists because they're all like in the same boat anyway. Like the distinctions sort of melt away under the similarity of oppression. And I think that's also something that is harder maybe for people in the global north to understand, like, the I'm with her liberals versus like the Bernie Sanders Democrats versus whatever whatever teen is out there with a ski mask at a rally or something, right? Like, at the end of the day, like, none of that matters to like Ron DeSantis, Meatball Ron. Like, he's basically assuming they're all the same person at the end of the day, and it's a challenge for the left to sort of create its own unified bloc. But maybe like one gift, if people could harness it, would be recognizing that like the enemy thinks that you're a unified bloc, so you might as well like show up to a rally together or something. I don't know. It's hard to make common cause with a certain class of liberal, at least, but for a lot of folks, it's like a good lesson in overcoming sectarianism, because like where the rubber has hit the road in lots of situations around the world, it's been that recognition of unity that has been able to actually build an alternative to that.
It's true. Ron DeSantis, at the end of the day, he's going to be scarfing down his pudding with his fingers and and repressing everyone, regardless of whether or not they have a "I'm with her" bumper sticker or if they have a DSA bumper sticker in the back of their car. Okay, so anyways, kind of circling back around to this to the theme of this section, right? That Romero thinks that the poor have a particular like perspective that is important for the church. And this is maybe a concluding thought that kind of gears toward that direction. Romero says, "It's the poor who enable us to understand what has really happened. That's why the church has understood the persecution from the perspective of the poor. Persecution has been occasioned by the defense of the poor. It amounts to nothing other than the church is taking upon herself the lot of the poor." That's where they're at, right? If you want to understand the types of persecution that that the poor are suffering, like, you have to kind of take up that perspective itself. And that's exactly what Romero says that the church has done in El Salvador. Not just like throwing in their lot with the poor, but also Romero says actively defending the poor in whatever way they can. So I think that's an important piece, right? You want to understand what this repression actually looks like and feels like, then you have to do it from this particular perspective of like the lowest common denominator in society, right? People who have who are the most vulnerable socially and economically.
Yeah.
And I don't know, a good perspective, right? You want to know what's going on. You have to look at the people who are going to be hurt the most.
Yeah, I think too that idea that it's a consequence of the church throwing in with the poor or taking upon itself a lot of the poor. I think that is significant. Romero is obviously himself kind of, it's like chilling to read that because he himself ends up paying that price. Right. But it's important too to recognize it's not just like a global South problem there either. Like, I was just thinking of the situation of Bruce Johnson and Eugenia Johnson, the two pastors of the United Methodist Church that became the People's Church that the Young Lords had taken over in Chicago. We did an episode about that a long time ago too, but this is the United States in 1969, and they were stabbed to death, and like they wouldn't have been if they hadn't basically aligned themselves with a particular group of people. And you see that sort of persecution across the U.S. as well, with like the way that people treat even like the Plowshares movement or Catholic workers folks getting arrested and all that kind of stuff. Like at the end of the day, like the persecution of Christians happens because Christians take up the side of the poor, not because they believe that, like, I don't know, Jesus is God or something, right? And I think that's the narrative that also has to be dispelled, that like when Christians are persecuted, it isn't it's not a culture war issue, right? It's like actual persecution is always tied to political persecution, which is tied to things like class rule and and all the rest of it. Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, just kind of reiterating the point you made at the top of this episode, Matt, talking about persecution, but just to point out that, like, it's not just like so-called underdeveloped countries that are sort of dealing with this. Like, anybody who ends up throwing in with the poor in a really meaningful way is gonna, have a hard time because of it, I think, in some way or other.
I think it's hugely important to really lay that out, exactly why Christians do face persecution. I don't know. I mean, the listeners of this podcast are diverse people who have different backgrounds. But for me personally, I think that I first learned about Christian persecution in a very skewed way. I don't know if this is the case for you either, Dean, but like right after Columbine happened, there's like this story circulating. I don't even know if it's true. It might be like apocryphal, but that like there was a girl, a woman student, a female student, if you will, who had, a gun to their head in Columbine, and they were asking if they really believed in Jesus or something, and she said yes, right? And like that's Christian persecution. That's what it really looks like. People are going to persecute you because you believe in Jesus Christ as being the Son of God, and like that's clearly not true. I mean, maybe that happens in some places where particular types of like religious violence are more common, but like when we're talking about the United States, when we're talking about South America and North America, I mean, the historical examples are pretty clear. It's not because people like believe in Jesus. That's like not the problem for Christian persecution. It's because people recognize the ethical like ramifications of believing in Jesus as also meaning they have to throw in with the poor, or you have to throw in with like the people who are most marginalized, or even like throw in with creation, with environment, like with water defenders or something like that, right? That's why people face Christian persecution, not for made up cultural reasons.
Right. Yeah, I should clarify too. Like, there are situations in the world where Christians do get persecuted just for being Christian, like whatever in India or something like that. So like, not to dismiss that, those things do really happen, and it is very bad. But yeah, in the United States, that's not what's happening. It's a different situation. Christians are the ones persecuting other Christians in the United States.
Yeah, an important clarification. Just because you're a Christian and you have to recognize that trans people are real humans that do exist, that does not mean you're being persecuted, which is news to I think a lot of Christians.
Yeah, happy holidays, am I right?
That's right. So the next big theme that we need to talk about here in this address is the way that Romero kind of figures out the relationship between religion and politics. I think it's really interesting. His way in is interesting, and he's writing this before Ignacio Ellacuría wrote The Crucified People. But you find a similar type of resonance, I think, between these two ideas, which, again, that shared spirit between Romero and liberation theology, even though they're not one and the same necessarily. So Romero says this: because the church has opted for the truly poor, not the fictitiously poor, the church lives in a political world, and she fulfills herself as church also through politics. It cannot be otherwise if the church, like Jesus, is to turn herself towards the poor. So this is, I mean, just like a beginning statement here, but this is important because, like, if the church is going to do the things he's saying, right, or if the church is doing the things he's saying and throwing in with the poor in this like really serious way and kind of taking the poor's word for how the world works, you have to recognize that that's already pretty political. Because, I mean, poor people are not natural. It's not natural to like, wealth inequality is not just sort of like a state in nature or something, right? Because poor is a category that is produced and only lives in relationship to the rich. So anyways, I'll have to say, if the church is going to take up that particular perspective, that means that the church is already kind of engaged politically through the lens, right? The moment that your church says that it has some type of option for the poor or that wants to pay attention to the poor, it's engaged in politics, whether it likes it or not, which I think is important to recognize. I think even for like well-meaning liberal churches, they'll say something about the poor, but not necessarily think of themselves as, doing politics or being involved in politics. But whether they like it or not, they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good counterpoint even to the sort of, I guess, like form of neither right nor left stuff that you get in Christian discourse, which we've talked about on the show at length, ad nauseum, I guess. But one way that is kind of neat maybe about how Romero tackles it is like, it's one thing to be mad about it as a left-wing person, and I am mad about it as a left-wing person, to be like, these aren't the same. But I think Romero also is challenging that same sentiment from a different perspective or different point of view, which is to say, like, yeah, you can say that Jesus is outside the left and right category or whatever, and you can even say that he's political, because a lot of them will say that. But Romero is trying to be like, yeah, but like, how? how does the church like fulfill itself through politics, is how he puts it, and I think that's really important, because a lot of Christians kind of get away with being like, yeah, Jesus, he's political, but like not the way that you think he is. And they just kind of leave it at that, right? It's a vague sort of appeal to depth that really is vacuous. But Romero is trying to say something more. And I think that comes out when he talks about sin. He has a neat way of kind of parsing it out. He says, we know that a sin is really mortal, not only in the sense of the interior death of the person who commits the sin, but also because of the real objective death that sin produces. Let us remind ourselves of a fundamental fact of our Christian faith. Sin killed the Son of God, and sin is what continues to kill the children of God. We see that basic truth of the Christian faith daily in the situation of our country. It's impossible to offend God without offending one's neighbor or sister. And the worst offense against God, the worst form of secularism, as one of our Salvadoran theologians has said, is, and here he does quote Ea Curia, but a different piece, is to turn children of God, temples of the Holy Spirit, the body of Christ in history, into victims of oppression and injustice, into slaves to economic greed, into fodder for political repression. The worst of these forms of secularism is the denial of grace by the objectivization of this world as an operative presence of the powers of evil, the visible presence of the denial of God. And I think that is very good, very important. It's that kind of like theological language, but that is saying something actually meaningful instead of like weaseling out of the complexities of a material situation. And I think that's what I like about Ea Curia and Romero both, is that for them, theology is not a way of like escaping politics, but it's a way of really affirming the complexity of the material and getting involved in it in a unique way as a Christian person, right? Like, even sometimes, like, I love Ernesto Cardinal. He's my fave, 100%. But Cardinal too, like, maybe I like him because I share with Cardinal a kind of impatience with theology. Like, Cardinal will be like, yeah, here's some theological categories, some Christian stuff, whatever. At the end of the day, I don't know, like, you just gotta, like, beat capitalism, and we'll kind of, like, talk about it with some great religious poetry and so on, but, Cardinal will admit that, like, he's got to be reminded every once in a while that he is a priest, And I think what I like about Romero and Ea Curia is they do have a kind of like thicker Christian identity that I think for me sometimes is really important to connect with and to feel like an actual Christian and not just like a guy reading about Christianity, which is easy to turn into that even if you go to church. So anyway, all that to say, I think what Romero is really giving us here is like a theological politics that has more going on in it than the vague appeal to like Jesus being political.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Well, okay, I'm sorry to bring it up in the podcast, but just a few weeks ago, I'm just gonna do it. It's our podcast. We do what we want. Just a few weeks ago, Twitter's favorite liberal pastor Brian Zahn did tweet something that was very annoying. So annoying that he actually did delete it. But he was talking about how he's gotten past the left and right distinction in politics, and that's been really liberating for him. And I hate that so much, exactly for this very reason, right? Because just like Romero says, it's sin that killed Jesus, and it's sin that kills the world's children or whatever, all of God's children. And if you're someone like Brian Zahn and you're like, well, I just want to get beyond the left and right dichotomy because I don't know, that's how I feel, or whatever, for whatever reason you feel that way, because you want to transcend the dirtiness of politics or whatever. Like, it's so insufficient, because if you think that Jesus has something to say that is political, or if you think that Christianity has something to say that's political, like, who is killing the children? How are you going to get them to stop? Like, you can't even answer the most basic questions if you want to transcend the left and right dichotomy, because you have to answer those fundamental questions if you want to do politics, right? Who would you hold accountable for the mass death of like poor people that like who die from poverty sort of caused reasons? How would you even do that? It doesn't make sense, Brian Zond. I know he listens, so that's why I'm saying it directly to him. Of course. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'll stop.
Well, wait. One other thing though, on this left-right thing, I think something that comes to mind too in an important way with respect to Romero's life is that at the end of the day, like, one side is the side that murdered him, and it wasn't the left. Like, I'm sorry. Like,
Oh no, that's
like,
true.
The guerrillas, it's not to say that like every left guerrilla movement is blameless, because that's not true. Like, war is bad, and left-wing guerrillas do bad things, and they should be held accountable for that too. Like, I think that's important. And revolutionary movements that are good and have a moral character, they also do that, right? Like, that's a part of the story of Cuba. It's a part of the story of Nicaragua. So it's not to like just say, well, this is a sort of purity test or something, but like, at the end of the day, like, the people that Romero was ultimately fighting in a significant way when he's talking about politics are the right, the fascist right. Like, it's Diobusan that killed him, a fascist guy, a right-wing guy, with the support of, first the Democrats, for sure, Jimmy Carter, and then even more strongly the Republicans. And, the Democrats are also a right-wing force in a kind of like global scale of political agency or whatever. And I think it's just important to recognize that like getting beyond the right and left divide is like not like, if you try to do that, you're just not going to understand why Oscar Romero was murdered. Like, it just like prevents you from, I guess, having an analysis of like what the real options are for getting out of that situation of sin. So anyway, just to put a fine point on it, like, the right is who killed Romero and the left is who was like fighting them at the time. It's important to point that out.
It seems like an obvious note, but you're right. It is important to point out. Because Twitter pastor might not recognize it. That's for sure. Okay. The last big theme that I want to pull out, I think, is maybe the most important one. And that is, okay. So Romero, throughout this entire address, he's talking about what the church in El Salvador is doing. And when I was reading that, I was having a very weird, like, alienated experience, because it's like, I've never heard of a church like this before. The church that he's describing is one that I would very much like to go to. I'd like to be a part of. I would like to be a member of, but it's not the one I'm familiar with particularly. So I thought it might be interesting to think about the Church of El Salvador, the one that Romero is describing, as a possible church, right? Like, this is the future that could be, and because it's a past that has been. An important distinction, right? So there's so much bad stuff in Christianity, stuff I don't like, worse than Brian Zahn for sure. And I think it's really important to like find ways to express what it is you want out of this kind of religious arrangement, and give yourself permission to be that type of person, even though the type of church that you see in the world sucks ass and it's bad. So in this small portion of the podcast, we're doing some like we're doing some mood boarding. We're putting all together these ideas of the church that we would like to see in the world, and maybe we'll get there someday. Maybe we won't. Maybe be the Christian you want to be in the world, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So here's Romero on some of these ideas of what the church is. The world of the poor, with its very concrete social and political characteristics, teach us where the church can incarnate herself in such a way that she will avoid the false universalism that inclines the church to associate herself with the powerful.
Love it.
Yeah. The world of the poor teaches us about the nature of Christian love, a love that certainly seeks peace, but also unmasks false pacifism, the pacifism of resignation and inactivity. It's very good. It's very good stuff. A church that is like in the world, they recognize it's doing politics at some level, even though it's maybe not like, it's not like completely in line with like the guerrillas fighting the government, but it's not out of line with them either, which I think is an important distinction. This is definitely the type of church that you'd want to be a part of, though.
Yeah, I agree. Keeping the train going, adding to our mood board, or vision board here. I also really like what Romero has to say about the church here in its own posture. He says, the world of the poor teaches us that liberation will arrive only when the poor are not simply on the receiving end of handouts from government or from the church. Haha, just wait, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. But when they themselves are the masters of and protagonists in their own struggle and liberation, thereby unmasking the roots of false paternalism, including ecclesiastical paternalism. I like this in particular because, first of all, it's a great roundabout way of saying you should cease the means of production. But also the idea that you would like identify that the poor shouldn't be on the receiving end of church handouts is really important. It's pretty routine, I think, that like churches rightly provide all kinds of services in societies under capitalism where like people need them, like food kitchens and whatever, secondhand shops and all that kind of stuff. And they have to do that because capitalism has all these cracks that need to be filled and the church fills them. But it creates this weird like symbiotic or parasitic relationship where like governments then also do just kind of rely on churches to do it, and churches kind of also rely on the government to like not fix that problem so that they can like continue to do an important ministry or something. And I think it is significant, like, in the most extreme cases, like it's been a way for the church to even argue against like state intervention. The case I have in mind in particular is in Quebec. The church was basically responsible for delivering everything from like schools to hospitals to social services. And it wasn't until the 1960s that there was a pretty rapid and massive secularization campaign that basically nationalized a lot of those services in important ways. But the idea was like, yeah, the church is just kind of there to, paternalistically like give to the kids all the stuff that they need. And I think what Romero is trying to say is like the church has to give that up, and also like people should just be treated like adults, including the poor. And like, they should be able to build a society the way that they want to and empowered to do so. And I think that's a really good, important note for churches in general to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. The Quebec example is such a high level and interesting thing. When I read that piece, I thought about the endless conversations I've had with people at my church about like, what do we do about the homeless people sleeping on our steps? And it's like, it's like, how do we provide them with the things that they need? And it's like, well, you don't really need to provide them with anything. You need to give them the space to like do what they need to do themselves, or for them to figure it out themselves, which is a really hard idea for churches to get in on, because it's our building. They think it's our this, it's our that, and never thinking of the poor as sort of like protagonists, like Romero says. That's wrong. You need to shift your brain. The people sleeping on your steps are there 7 days a week, and you're only there on Sunday. So get off your high horse.
There's also a nice piece, as we're adding to this here, where Romero says, the real world of the poor also teaches us about Christian hope, a tough topic these days. The church prepares a new heaven and a new earth. She knows, moreover, that no socio-political system can be exchanged for the final fullness that is given by God, but she has also learned that transcendent hope must be preserved by signs of hope in history, no matter how simple they may apparently be. This one's great for your, like, troublesome Christian like uncle who at Thanksgiving is always like, well, I don't, capitalism, communism, they're all the same, who cares? I'm just like, waiting to go to heaven, pie in the sky, by and by. God will sort it all out. It's like there's nothing kind of going on here that would really make any difference. I think Romero is great because he's like, yeah, of course, no political system is really like the fullness of God's presence. But anyway, like, also, if you're going to have this transcendent hope, you do have to like materialize it on this side of history. I think that is a nice way to maybe like even find some points of contact for talking with people who like are not going to readily agree with like an Ernesto Cardenal, but like, Romero maybe encourages them to, follow a thought a little bit further.
All right, this is the conclusion of the address, and I think it's good. In instruct, Romero says, every Christian used to say, Gloria Dei vivens homo. The glory of God is the living person. We can make this more concrete by saying Gloria Dei vivens pauper. The glory of God is the living poor person. From the perspective of the transcendence of the gospel, I believe we can determine what the life of the poor truly is. And I also believe that by putting ourselves alongside the poor and trying to bring them to life, we shall come to know the eternal truth of the gospel. So for Romero, this is kind of like the concluding point, because he thinks that the existence of the poor, the experience of the poor, is like the most instructive thing to the church, and to ignore it would be to ignore the gospel. And if you really want to see what the gospel is about, you have to kind of take this perspective on. And so much so that he thinks it's like the operating logic of Christianity is to like figure out the life of the poor and how to be a part of that. Again, not a church I've ever been a part of, but man, it's a compelling vision. I think it's great. Definitely putting that one at the top of the mood board. It's the church you want to see in the world. Absolutely.
Yeah, get everybody at your church at the end to be like, Gloria Dei, vivens pauper. Just start saying it to people and see how they react. Put it on a piece of paper. You can slip it to people in the pews. Everybody should make things more concrete by just saying that. I think that's the way to start.
I think so too. I mean, it's important because I don't think that I feel like it'd be hard for a church in the United States, even a liberal one, to really articulate this as its like central vision. And that's too bad. I think that's really bad. It's a failure. It's hard to see the gospel apart from that. I think for me particularly, but it's definitely the church that I'd like to see.
Yeah, me too. Well, you got to build it.
Yeah, I guess you got to. You can't just join another denomination. This denomination doesn't exist. Unfortunately.
Yeah. Well,
all right,
struggle is real.
The class struggle is real. At the end of the episode, we're now just past Romero's feast day. It was yesterday, but what's your takeaway? I don't know. Like, what do you think about this guy? Here's even a bigger question. Maybe to meditate on here for a second. Not being the type of Catholic that Romero was, what do you do on feast days? What are you supposed to think about? And like, I didn't even really feast yesterday. After we're done talking, I'm definitely going to go eat some chips, so I can kind of maybe count that. But what am I supposed to do apart from just eat the big bag of chips?
Yeah, it's a great celebration. It's a festival day. It's a time to celebrate the life of that particular person. So there's often like special masses or actually Development of Peace. The folks that I spend a lot of time with did Romero Mass previously, not this year, but in previous years. And it's a good sort of excuse, I guess, to think through like what the life of that person means for us today. I think it's really special to be able to have a feast day for Saint Oscar Romero, and one that's also tied to his assassination, his martyrdom. For me, I've joked about it as the feast day of anti-imperialism, because it's like, you know, when you have like a feast day for whatever, St. Francis of Assisi, you're like, yeah, I'm going to think about, you know, I don't know, the nativity and all the cool stuff that he said about the moon and whatever. But when it comes to Romero, it's like, yeah, you want to remember these important sort of things that he said and stood for, but you also want to remember like why he got murdered. And I think that is a special thing to have in a church calendar, because it's like, it's so contemporary. It doesn't feel as alien. And like I said, like the person who ordered his murder, like his son is a major player in politics right now in El Salvador, or like Elliot Abrams is still floating around writing op-eds every once in a while that appear in like major newspapers. And, you know, like we are celebrating the feast day of this person who's dead because of them. And I think that kind of like contemporaneity, for me at least, is really like unsettling. Like whenever that comes around, I'm always like, whoa, you know, we're still in it. And the church kind of has marked out this day to basically celebrate like a victim of American imperialism. I think that is like important to sort of frame that there's a space in the calendar to do that in a liturgical way.
Man, how recent this all is very mind-blowing. The more you say it, the more it's hitting me. I'm thinking about it a lot. All right, well, that sounds good.
So you can eat your chips, but also say whatever the anti-Pledge of Allegiance is.
Yeah, it's a 5 Iron Frenzy song, and I'll definitely sing it a little bit. That's great. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. If you support us on Patreon, you get access to our Behind the Paywall podcast, which will be coming out soonish, probably. Just wait for it. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. You also get access to our secret Behind the Paywall Discord channel, where we talk about recipes and the Pope in his big coat and all kinds of other great things. Lots of good memes. It's good. You're going to love it once you're a part of it. Get in the mix, though, and don't sit this one out, because, I don't know, just do it. It's great.
Get in the mix, though, is a great tagline.
Get in the mix, though. Come to our youth group. All right. Thanks for listening, guys. We definitely appreciate it. Our intro music is by Amaria Armstrong. Our outro music is by Theological Spoon. And we'll see you next week.
I don't want to get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have